The rain fell hard against the glass walls of the lavish mansion, each droplet running down like a tear on the face of a place built on power, wealth, and appearances. Outside, black cars gleamed in the driveway while inside, chandeliers glistened and the air buzzed with the soft chatter of the city's elite. Tonight was not just another dinner, it was a showcase. A gathering of power brokers, investors, and influential figures who orbited around Richard Sterling, one of the wealthiest men in the city. The butlers moved swiftly, their polished shoes barely making a sound across the marble floors. The smell of aged wine and freshly prepared dishes filled the air. But amid the grandeur, something fragile lingered, a tension that no guest could quite name but all could feel. And then, the sound cut through the harmony like a whip-raised voice. Sharp, humiliating, impossible to ignore. "Get out of the way, boy! You're clumsy, just like the staff." Every eye turned. Standing near the grand dining table was Adrian, Richard Sterling's only son. His brown hair was slightly tousled, his expression frozen between shock and embarrassment. A tray he had been holding trembled in his hands before slipping, silverware clattering across the pristine floor. The insult came not from a stranger but from Gregory Vaughn, a smug business partner of Richard's, known for his arrogance. He smirked, eyes gleaming with cruel amusement, as though he had just tossed aside an unworthy servant. The room went silent. Guests looked on, unsure whether to laugh, to pity, or to pretend nothing had happened. And there stood Adrian, cheeks flushed red, throat tight, fingers curling helplessly at his sides. He was no servant, no hired hand. He was the heir to Richard Sterling's empire. But in that moment, stripped of dignity by a single sneer, he looked as though he didn't belong. From across the room, Richard Sterling froze mid-step, his glass of wine trembling slightly in his hand. The words echoed in his mind like the staff. His son, his blood, his only child, reduced to nothing before his own eyes. Richard's gaze darkened, a storm gathering behind calm eyes. Those who knew him understood that beneath his tailored suits and measured words, lay a man who built his empire not through inheritance, but through battles. Boardroom wars, ruthless negotiations, and sacrifices no one in this room could imagine. And now, someone dared to humiliate his son inside his house. Adrian bent down quickly, his hands shaking as he scrambled to pick up the fallen forks and knives. His lips pressed tight, fighting back words he wanted to shout but couldn't. He knew this world, he had grown up in it. Every movement was watched, every mistake magnified. And now, he was the punchline at his father's table. Gregory chuckled, muttering to those near him, "Doesn't even know how to carry a tray. What's next, Sterling? Training your son to wash dishes." Laughter rippled, shallow but cutting, filling the space like broken glass crunching underfoot. Richard placed his glass down slowly, deliberately. The room, sensing something, quieted. He stepped forward, the sound of his shoes echoing through the hall. The sharp edge in his stare made Gregory's smirk falter ever so slightly. "Gregory." Richard's voice carried weight, deep and cold. "Do you know whose son you just insulted?" Gregory shifted, arrogance flickering but not extinguished. "Of course. But maybe the boy should act like a Sterling if he wants to be treated like one." Richard's jaw tightened. The guests waited, breath caught in their throats. Adrian rose to his feet, clutching the tray to his chest like a shield, his eyes darting toward his father. He expected, no, feared, that his father might scold him too, that he might be left standing alone in this humiliation. But instead, Richard stepped closer to his son, his presence commanding, protective. He placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder. Not gently, but firmly, like a declaration. His voice, steady yet edged with fury, rolled through the silence. "This is my son. The blood of Richard Sterling runs through him. And if anyone here forgets that again..." His eyes bore into Gregory's, cold and merciless. "They'll find themselves cast out faster than the garbage." Gasps whispered through the crowd. Gregory's face flushed crimson, the smirk gone, replaced by something closer to panic. He tried to laugh it off, but it rang hollow. Richard didn't move his gaze, pinning him in place like prey before a predator. For Adrian, the moment burned into his soul. The weight of humiliation lingered, but so did something else. Something unexpected. His father, a man of few displays of affection, had chosen him. Publicly, defiantly. But the night wasn't over. Because beneath Richard's defense lay something deeper. An unspoken truth. He had seen weakness in his son before. And tonight's incident only sharpened the conflict he carried within. Was Adrian truly ready to inherit his world? Or would moments like this prove Gregory right? That the boy could never stand as a Sterling should. As the evening resumed with strained smiles and forced laughter, Adrian sat quietly. The words replaying in his mind. Clumsy. Like the staff. He couldn't shake it. And though his father's hand had been firm on his shoulder, the fire of shame burned hotter than the warmth of protection. Richard, too, sat in silence, the storm inside him growing. He had defended his son tonight. But what he did next, the choice he would make after seeing his heir humiliated, would change both their lives forever. And it was only the beginning. The air in the grand dining hall still carried a strange heaviness, even as laughter and chatter tried to paper over what had just happened. The clink of glasses resumed. Music drifted again from the corner quartet. But the truth lingered in the eyes of every guest. They had witnessed a fracture, a wound that could not be hidden. Adrian sat stiffly in his chair, hands clenched in his lap, staring at his reflection in the polished silver of his plate. His cheeks still burned, his chest still tight. He had wanted so badly to impress his father tonight. To stand tall among the business titans, to show that he belonged in their world. But instead, he had been reduced to a child fumbling with a tray. A laughingstock. Richard, at the head of the table, kept his composure, his face an unreadable mask. But beneath that mask, his thoughts swirled darkly. He knew what the others were thinking. They questioned his son's strength, his presence, his ability to carry the sterling legacy. And for Richard, that was a dagger sharper than any insult. The meal continued, but Richard hardly tasted the food. His mind drifted back to his own beginnings. He had clawed his way up from nothing. Sleeping in the back of a broken car, taking jobs no one else wanted. Swallowing his pride just to survive. He had fought tooth and nail for every dollar, every ounce of respect. And now, here sat his son, raised in comfort, shielded from hardship, humiliated before his very eyes. When the last guest left and the last car rolled away into the rain-soaked night, silence fell heavy in the mansion. Adrian lingered in the hall, unsure whether to retreat to his room or face his father. Richard stood by the massive window, city lights glinting on the glass, his reflection tall and severe against the skyline. Feather. Adrian's voice was tentative, fragile. I didn't mean. Richard turned, his eyes sharp. You didn't mean to drop the tray. You didn't mean to let Vaughn humiliate you. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of disappointment more crushing than a shout. Adrian's throat tightened. I was just trying to help, I didn't expect him to treat you like a servant. Richard cut in, stepping closer. His tone hardened. Adrian, in this world, perception is power. And tonight, you let them see weakness. The words struck Adrian like blows. He swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in his eyes. I'm not you. He whispered. I can't be perfect like you. Richard's expression flickered. Something unspoken crossed his eyes. But he quickly suppressed it. Perfection isn't what I demand. Strength is. Respect is. And if you can't command those things, then everything I've built will crumble the moment it's in your hands. Adrian lowered his gaze. He wanted to scream, to tell his father how impossible it felt to live up to a man who seemed carved from stone. But instead, he only nodded weakly, retreating into silence. Later that night, Richard remained awake, pacing his study, the fire casting shadows across his face. Gregory Vaughn's smirk replayed in his mind, taunting him. He could not allow anyone, not Gregory, not the board, not the world, to think his son was unworthy. But how could Adrian prove himself if he had never tasted struggle? Richard poured a glass of whiskey, staring into its amber depths. His mind settled on a decision, one that would test not only Adrian but himself as a father. He whispered into the empty room, as though speaking it aloud sealed the choice. It's time he learns what it means to be a sterling. The next morning, Adrian found himself summoned to the study. He entered hesitantly, the smell of cigars and leather filling the room. Richard sat behind the desk, his posture commanding, his eyes unwavering. Adrian. Richard began, last night was a turning point. You may not see it yet, but I do. And I refuse to let my son be seen as weak again. Adrian shifted nervously. What does that mean? It means, Richard said slowly, you're going to earn the respect you expect to inherit. Not because of my name, not because of this house, but because you've proven yourself capable of standing on your own. Adrian's brows furrowed. I don't understand. Richard leaned forward. You will. Starting today, you'll step outside of this mansion, outside of my shadow. No servants. No luxury. You'll work. You'll fight. You'll struggle like I once did. And only then will you understand what it means to lead. Adrian's eyes widened. You're sending me away. Richard's voice was calm, but unyielding. Yes. Consider it your trial. Fail, and you'll have no place in this empire. Succeed, and you'll return not as a boy shamed by a tray, but as a man worthy of the sterling name. Adrian's heart pounded. Part of him felt fear clawing at his chest, but another part, buried deep, felt a strange spark. A chance. Maybe even freedom. But he also knew this wasn't just about him. It was about a father's pride, a legacy on the line, and the unspoken distance between them. The road ahead would not only test his strength, but also force both father and son to confront the walls they had built around their hearts. As Richard dismissed him with a firm nod, Adrian left the study, his mind spinning. He didn't know what awaited him beyond the mansion gates. But he knew one thing. His life was about to change forever. And in the silence of the study, Richard Sterling stared out at the city once more, his jaw tight, his heart heavier than he let anyone know. He had made his choice. But whether it would save his son, or break him, was a question that even a man like Richard could not yet answer. The morning sun barely pierced through the heavy clouds as Adrian Sterling stood at the gates of his father's estate, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. For the first time in his life, the towering gates didn't symbolize protection. They symbolized exile. Behind him was the marble fortress of wealth and legacy. Ahead lay a world he had only glimpsed from car windows and news headlines. A black SUV pulled away, leaving him alone on the sidewalk, the crunch of gravel under his shoes louder than the cars rushing past on the distant road. Adrian adjusted the strap of his bag, swallowing hard. His father hadn't given him much. No credit cards, no chauffeur, no connections. Just a modest envelope of cash, a cheap phone, and a directive that rang in his ears like a verdict. Find your worth. Adrian looked down at his clothes. Designer jeans, a jacket tailored to fit perfectly. They screamed privilege in a way that suddenly felt like a target on his back. He turned toward the city, his pulse racing. For the first time, he realized how unprepared he was for the life he was about to step into. Hours later, Adrian wandered through the heart of the city. The skyscrapers towered above him, their mirrored windows reflecting the storm inside his chest. He passed street vendors shouting over the sizzle of grills, construction workers hauling heavy loads, and children chasing each other in worn sneakers. It all felt alien, vivid, loud, unfiltered. By afternoon, Adrian's stomach growled. He ducked into a small diner on the corner of a busy street. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee wrapped around him. It was nothing like the carefully plated meals at the Sterling mansion. Here, the tables were scratched, the floor scuffed. But there was a warmth he had never felt in his father's dining hall. He sat at the counter, fumbling with the menu. A waitress with tired eyes and a friendly smile approached. "What'll it be, sweetheart?" Adrian hesitated, glancing at the prices. The money in his envelope suddenly felt fragile, finite. Just a coffee. Black. She raised an eyebrow but nodded, pouring the steaming liquid into a chipped mug. Adrian took a sip and grimaced. Bitter, strong, nothing like the carefully crafted brews he was used to. But he forced it down, reminding himself that this was part of his trial. As he sat there, a group of young men entered the diner, their laughter filling the space. They looked rough, their jackets worn, their voices loud. One of them, a tall guy with sharp eyes, bumped into Adrian's stool on purpose. "Watch it, rich boy," he sneered, eyeing Adrian's jacket. Adrian stiffened. He wanted to respond, to defend himself. But the words caught in his throat. The men chuckled, shaking their heads as they slid into a booth. Adrian stared down at his coffee, the familiar sting of humiliation creeping back. But then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed something. An older man at the end of the counter, watching him. His beard was flecked with gray, his clothes simple but neat. There was something steady about him, something that reminded Adrian of a rock in the middle of a rushing river. "You're not from around here, are you?" the man said, his voice calm but direct. Adrian shook his head slowly. "Just trying to figure things out." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "World's not kind to boys who look like they've never had dirt under their nails." Adrian bristled, shame tightening his chest. "I'm not weak," he said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. The man's eyes softened with something between pity and challenge. "That's what every young man says, until the world proves otherwise." He extended a hand. "Name's Cole." Adrian hesitated, then shook his hand. "Adrian." Cole nodded, as though he'd already guessed it. "Well, Adrian, the city doesn't care who your daddy is. Out here, respect isn't given. It's earned. You want to survive? You'll need to decide whether you're going to stand up, or keep letting others walk over you. The words stung because they were true. Adrian thought of Gregory Vaughn's smirk, the laughter at the table, his father's disappointed eyes. He tightened his grip on the mug. I don't want to be walked over anymore. Cole gave a small, approving nod. Good. Then start by working. This diner's always short on hands. You'll learn quick enough whether you're cut out for it. Adrian blinked. Work here? Like as a waiter? Cole chuckled. Unless you think you're too good for it. The challenge hung heavy in the air. Adrian's pride flared, but so did his resolve. He thought of his father's words, earn it. Slowly, he nodded. I'll do it. And so it began. Adrian Sterling, the millionaire's son, spent his first day bussing tables, washing dishes, wiping down counters sticky with syrup and coffee stains. His hands ached. His back burned, and every muscle screamed in protest. By nightfall, his designer clothes were smeared with grease and sweat, his hair clinging to his forehead. But beneath the exhaustion, something unexpected flickered inside him. For the first time, he wasn't being handed respect, he was trying to build it. Piece by piece. That night, as he collapsed onto the narrow cot in a cheap rented room above the diner, Adrian stared at the cracked ceiling, his body aching. He thought of his father's cold words, the humiliation that had started it all, and the promise he had made silently to himself. I'll prove them wrong. I'll prove him wrong. I'll become someone no one can ever look down on again. Far away. In the Sterling mansion, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't know what his son was enduring at that very moment, but he knew one thing. He had set events in motion that could either forge Adrian into the man he needed to be, or break him beyond repair. And in that silent tension, father and son began a journey that neither could yet imagine the ending of. The alarm clock rattled against the nightstand, its shrill ring echoing through the cramped room. Adrian jolted awake, his body aching from yesterday's work. The cot beneath him was stiff, the sheets thin and scratchy. Gone were the silk blankets, the soft mattress, the quiet mornings in the mansion. Instead, he woke to the smell of frying oil drifting up through the floorboards, the muffled clatter of dishes from the diner below, and the sound of traffic already snarling outside. He dragged himself upright, rubbing his sore shoulders. Every muscle protested, but he forced himself to stand. For the first time in his life, no one was there to pick out his clothes, no one to iron them or lay out breakfast. He pulled on the same jeans and shirt he had worn yesterday, still faintly stained with grease, and headed downstairs. The diner was already alive with movement. Waitresses rushed between tables, shouting orders to the cook. The smell of bacon, eggs, and burnt toast filled the air. Adrian slipped behind the counter, tying on the apron one of the staff had tossed him the day before. Sterling! The cook barked from the kitchen. You're late. Coffee pots aren't gonna fill themselves. Adrian grabbed the pot, his hands still clumsy as he weaved between tables. He poured for one customer, nearly spilling, then rushed to refill another's cup. Some patrons ignored him, others grunted their thanks, and a few eyed him skeptically, wondering what a kid like him was doing here. By noon, his shirt clung to him with sweat, his arms sore from carrying trays. He had dropped a plate once, shattering it across the floor. And the burst of laughter from a nearby booth echoed in his ears like Gregory Vaughn's cruel chuckle at the mansion. He clenched his jaw and cleaned it up, refusing to let himself break. Cole, the older man from the day before, watched from his seat at the counter. When Adrian passed, he muttered quietly, "You've got two choices, kid. You let their laughter define you, or you get back up and keep moving until they've got nothing left to laugh at." Adrian said nothing, but the words dug deep. Later that night, as he scrubbed dishes in the back, a waitress named Marla leaned against the counter, lighting a cigarette. "You don't belong here," she said casually, exhaling smoke. Adrian stiffened. "What do you mean? You've got soft hands, nice teeth, no calluses. You're not like the rest of us." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "So what's your story? Why's a boy with manners like yours bussing tables in a hole like this?" Adrian hesitated, staring at the soapy water. He couldn't tell her the truth. That he was the son of Richard Sterling, one of the wealthiest men in the city. That he was here because his father thought him weak. Instead, he forced a shrug. "Just trying to figure things out." Marla smirked. "Aren't we all?" Days bled into weeks. Adrian worked from dawn until the late hours of the night, his body slowly toughening, his movements becoming steadier. He learned to balance trays without shaking, to handle rude customers with a calm smile, to wipe down a dozen tables in record time. Each small victory felt like a step toward something bigger, though he couldn't yet name what. But the city was not kind. One evening, as Adrian left the diner, he was stopped by the same group of young men who had mocked him on his first day. The leader, the tall one with sharp eyes, shoved him against the wall. "Look at you," he sneered. "Rich boy thinks he can play poor. That jacket still looks like it costs more than my rent." Adrian's pulse spiked. "I don't want trouble." The man laughed cruelly. "Trouble's already found you." He grabbed Adrian's collar, yanking him forward. The others closed in, circling. For a moment Adrian froze, the same helplessness from the mansion dinner clawing at him. But then, something inside shifted. He thought of Cole's words. He thought of his father's cold stare. He thought of every plate he had scrubbed, every blister on his hands, every drop of sweat he had spilled. And then he pushed back. It wasn't graceful. His punch was clumsy, his stance shaky, but it was enough to catch the man off guard. A scuffle broke out, fists flying, shouts echoing in the alley. Adrian took hits, his ribs aching, his lips splitting. But he didn't back down. By the time it ended, the men walked away muttering insults, but none of them laughed. Bruised and bloodied, Adrian staggered back to the diner, where Cole was waiting by the door. The older man's eyes flicked over the damage, then settled on Adrian's steady gaze. "You stood your ground," Cole said quietly. "Doesn't matter that you didn't win. What matters is you didn't let them walk over you." Adrian swallowed hard, tasting blood. "I'm tired of being humiliated." Cole nodded. "Good. Hold on to that. Let it shape you, not break you." That night, Adrian lay on his cot, every inch of his body aching. But for the first time, the pain didn't feel like defeat. It felt like proof that he had fought. Proof that he had refused to stay down. And somewhere deep inside, a seed of strength began to take root. Small, fragile, but growing. Meanwhile, miles away in the Sterling mansion, Richard sat at the head of a boardroom table, his executives discussing profits, mergers, strategies. But his mind wandered. He pictured Adrian alone in the city, stripped of luxury. He wondered if his son was faltering. Or if, perhaps, he was finally learning to rise. Richard didn't know that at that very moment, his son was nursing bruises not as a victim, but as a fighter. And for both father and son, the path they had chosen was pulling them closer to a reckoning neither could escape. Windows as Adrian wiped down tables late into the night. His ribs still ached from the alley fight days before, but he carried himself with a steadier presence now. The other staff noticed it. The way his shoulders no longer slumped. The way he looked people in the eye instead of down at the floor. Even the regulars at the diner gave him nods of acknowledgement. Small tokens of respect that meant more than all the polite smiles he'd received at the mansion. But respect was not the only thing Adrian was learning. He was learning hunger. The sharp sting when he skipped meals to stretch his money. He was learning fatigue. Working double shifts until his hands cramped. And he was learning humility. Accepting help when Marla slipped him a sandwich, or when Cole quietly covered a night's rent without asking for thanks. Cole had become more than an observer. He had become a mentor. The older man spoke in short, firm lessons, always testing Adrian's pride. One evening, after closing, Adrian found him sitting by the counter with a half-empty cup of coffee. "You've got fight in you now," Cole said, studying him with those steady eyes. "But fight without purpose. That's just swinging in the dark. What do you really want, kid?" Adrian hesitated, the rag still in his hands. The easy answer would have been respect. But the truth ran deeper. He thought of his father, of the mansion that now felt like a world away. He thought of Gregory Vaughn. Of that smirk that had sparked this entire chain of events. And finally, he thought of himself. Who he wanted to be, not just who he was expected to become. "I want to be someone who doesn't need my father's name to matter," Adrian said quietly. Cole gave a rare smile. "Then stop trying to live up to him. Start building your own." The words struck Adrian harder than any punch. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Sterling's empire faced its own test. Gregory Vaughn, humiliated at the dinner weeks earlier, had begun whispering in boardrooms, sowing seeds of doubt about Adrian's future as heir. "A boy who can't carry a tray," Gregory sneered in hushed conversations. "Is that the man you trust to protect billions?" At first, the board dismissed it. But Gregory was persistent, strategic, and ruthless. He framed Adrian not just as weak but as a liability. And though Richard never showed it, he knew the whispers were spreading. In one tense board meeting, Gregory spoke openly. "Richard. But legacies are fragile. If Adrian isn't ready, your empire will crumble the moment you step aside. Perhaps it's time to consider alternatives." The room fell silent. Richard's jaw clenched, his eyes burning into Gregory's smug face. He wanted to roar, to slam his fist on the table. Instead, he leaned back, his voice calm but dangerous. "Adrian is my son, my blood. And until I say otherwise, he is the heir. If anyone here forgets that..." His words echoed the warning he had given at the dinner. They won't be sitting at this table much longer. But even as Gregory's smile faltered, Richard felt the truth gnawing at him. Was Adrian truly ready? Had he made the right choice by casting him into the fire of the city? Or had he condemned his son to failure? Days later, Adrian's trial came in a form he didn't expect. A Saturday night rush filled the diner with impatient customers. Orders piled up, voices rose, and tempers flared. In the chaos, a man at one of the booths erupted, slamming his fist on the table. "I've been waiting 30 minutes. What kind of joke is this place?" he barked. His voice carried, drawing the attention of everyone inside. Adrian, balancing 2 plates, approached. His heart raced. Confrontation still sent sparks of panic through him. But he steadied his breath. "I'm sorry, sir. We're short staffed tonight. But I'll make sure your order is out next." The man sneered. "Sorry doesn't fill my stomach. You people can't do anything right." The old humiliation clawed at Adrian again. Memories of Vaughn's words ringing in his ears. But instead of shrinking, he straightened. "Sir," he said firmly, "you don't have to eat here. But if you stay, you'll get the same respect as every other customer. And you'll give it back in return." The diner fell silent. The man glared at Adrian, as though expecting him to buckle. But Adrian held his ground, his eyes unwavering. After a tense moment, the man muttered under his breath and sat back down. The silence broke with scattered nods, murmurs of approval. Cole, watching from his corner, gave the faintest smile. Later, as Adrian wiped down tables after closing, Marla approached him. "You handled that like a pro. Didn't think you had it in you." Adrian managed a small smile. "Neither did I." That night, lying on his cot, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Pride, not handed to him, not borrowed, but earned. Yet even as Adrian grew stronger, shadows lengthened over the sterling name. Gregory Vaughn was not done. His whispers grew into schemes, his schemes into plans. And soon, his actions would not only threaten Richard's empire, but force father and son back into the same storm, where pride, power, and family would collide in ways neither could imagine. Because Adrian's journey was no longer just about proving himself. It was about preparing for a battle that could destroy everything his father had built. And everything Adrian had just begun to find. The city skyline blazed with lights, a glittering mask that hid the storm brewing beneath. Richard Sterling stood alone in his office, high above it all, staring at the contracts spread across his desk. Numbers, mergers, and signatures. All meaningless compared to the battle he knew was coming. Gregory Vaughn had moved from whispers to outright betrayal. Rumors swirled in the press about Sterling's empire weakening, fueled by leaks Gregory himself had orchestrated. And the board, the same men who had once hung on Richard's every word, now questioned not only his leadership but Adrian's very right to inherit. Richard clenched his fist. He had weathered storms before, crushed rivals, built his empire from dust. But this was different. This was not just about business. This was about his son, his bloodline, his legacy, and deep down, it was about the gnawing fear he had carried since the night of the dinner. That maybe Gregory was right. That maybe Adrian wasn't ready. Meanwhile, across town, Adrian wiped sweat from his brow after a long shift. His knuckles were still bruised from the alley fight weeks ago, his hands scarred from endless dish scrubbing and table carrying. But when he looked at them now, he didn't see weakness. He saw proof of change. Proof that he had endured. Proof that he was no longer the boy who had once stood trembling under Gregory Vaughn's cruel words. Cole found him outside the diner, sitting on the curb, staring at the glow of the city. "You're tougher now," Cole said. "But toughness ain't the end of it. One day, you'll be tested in a way no fists or bruises can prepare you for. And when that day comes, you'll either stand or you'll break." Adrian looked at him, sensing the weight behind the words. "I'm ready," he said quietly, though his chest tightened with uncertainty. That test came sooner than either of them expected. It was during a charity gala, one of the city's grand events, attended by politicians, tycoons and media alike. Gregory Vaughn had arranged it, cleverly disguising his true purpose to humiliate Richard Sterling publicly and weaken him beyond repair. The rumor mill churned with speculation that Vaughn planned to announce a new alliance, a move that would strip Sterling Enterprises of its strongest partners. Richard arrived, his face composed, his presence commanding as always. But inside, his storm raged. He had considered leaving Adrian to his trial, far from this poisoned battlefield. Yet when he stepped into the ballroom, his heart sank. There, among the guests, was Adrian, standing tall, no longer in tailored suits, but in a modest black jacket, shoulders squared, eyes burning with something Richard hadn't seen before. "Father," Adrian said, approaching. His voice carried a new weight, steady and sure. "I heard what Vaughn is planning. I couldn't stay away." Richard's instinct was to rebuke him, to say this fight wasn't his. But something in Adrian's gaze stopped him. This was not the boy who had dropped a tray. This was a man forged in sweat, bruises, and humility. A man who had chosen to step back into the lion's den not out of obligation, but out of resolve. Gregory spotted them across the room and smirked like a wolf circling prey. He raised his glass, his voice carrying across the hall. "Richard Sterling, the great empire builder. Tell me, how does it feel, knowing the world whispers about your weak hair? Perhaps tonight, you'll do us the honor of admitting the truth, that the Sterling name ends with you." A gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras turned, every eye fixed on Richard. For a moment, the air thickened with silence. Richard opened his mouth, ready to strike back with the ferocity he was known for. But before he could speak, Adrian stepped forward. His voice cut through the hall, strong, unwavering. "My father doesn't need to answer that, Vaughn. I will." The room froze. Adrian's heart pounded, but his eyes locked onto Vaughn's with a steady fire. "You called me weak. You humiliated me in front of this city's elite. And maybe you were right. Back then. I wasn't ready. I was spoiled, clumsy, untested. But I've spent these months earning what no fortune could buy. Respect. Not because of my father's name, but because of who I chose to become." The crowd murmured, shifting, uncertain. Gregory sneered. "And what are you now, boy? A waiter, a dishwasher?" Adrian didn't flinch. "A man who knows the value of hard work. A man who understands people, not just profits. A man who's no longer afraid of you or anyone else who tries to treat him like less than he is." Cole, watching from the back of the room unseen, allowed himself a rare smile. Richard looked at his son, astonished. For the first time, he saw not weakness, not fragility, but strength, raw, undeniable, earned through pain and perseverance. Gregory tried to laugh, but it rang hollow. He raised his glass again, as though to dismiss it all. But the crowd no longer laughed with him. They were looking at Adrian now, with curiosity, even respect. Richard stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his son. His voice, calm but thunderous, carried through the hall. "This is my heir. Not because he carries my name, but because he has proven he can carry himself. And anyone who dares to question that, will answer to both of us." The hall erupted in murmurs of approval. Gregory's smirk faltered, his power slipping with every pair of eyes that turned away from him. He raised his glass one final time, but the toast rang empty, his defeat sealed not with contracts, but with the respect Adrian had claimed for himself. That night, as father and son stood outside the gala under the cold night sky, silence lingered between them. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice softer than Adrian had ever heard. "You've become more than I expected. More than I ever allowed myself to hope." Adrian looked at him, his jaw tight, his chest full. "I didn't just do it for me. I did it for us. For the name. For the legacy." Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Not as a declaration this time, but as a bond. No. From this night on, the legacy is yours to write. Not mine." For the first time, Adrian saw his father not as an untouchable giant, but as a man who had carried the weight of pride and fear for too long. And for the first time, Richard saw his son not as a boy needing protection, but as a man who had earned his place by fire. The rain began to fall again, soft against the pavement, as father and son walked side by side into the night. Not as a legend and his heir, but as equals, ready to face whatever storms the world would send their way.